It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Happy Halloween Eve. This week, I'm going to celebrate Halloween right with a fun, much more recent little indie horror film full of spooks and monsters set on, what else? Halloween. I'm going to discuss 2016's The Barn. Now, The Barn was written and directed by Justin M. Seaman. He's from Claysville, and that's a small town of less than 1,000 people in southwest Pennsylvania. And if you look Claysville up on Wikipedia, it shows you the Montgomery House, which is a historic building on the very western edge of the little borough. I don't know much about the Montgomery House, but I do know that it looks old, spooky, and probably someplace a Dracula would live. Seriously, it's gothic and surely super haunted. So it makes sense that a guy who ends up making horror films would come from a town like Claysville, Pennsylvania, with a house like that. The Barn turned out to be a bit of a hit. Reviews for the movie during its festival runs were mostly positive. They point out that Seaman obviously has a love of monster movies and 80s style video store horrors. It's so devoted to those 80s and 90s horrors and video store trips that an 8-bit video game was released to mobile devices just before it released, or before it started playing at those film festivals. Now, ultimately, The Barn is one of those examples of a crowdfunding type of movie. Now, it was, I think, partially funded on Indiegogo, but in 2015, Seaman launched a Kickstarter campaign to fund the post-production and merchandising production cost. And it was successful enough for him to be able to go back and add in scenes that he originally cut due to being a little strapped for cash. The sequel, which came out just last year, was also crowdfunded and was immediately successful and blew its goal marker out of the water. Now, as is the case with many crowdfunded indie horror films, there are a couple of names in this movie that help to attract some funders. The first is Linnea Quigley. Now, Quigley, of course, is a huge star of lower budget and indie horror films of the 80s and 90s. She's probably best known for playing more, let's call it forward types. Sometimes she's a punk, as seen in The Return of the Living Dead. Sometimes she's boy crazy, like in Night of the Demons. But generally speaking, she was rarely the quote-unquote good girl in whatever movie she was cast in. The other name pulled in for this is Ari Lehman. Now, Lehman mostly spends his time these days in a punk metal band named First Jason. And the reason why he named his band that is that he was the child actor who plays the first on-screen version of Jason Voorhees at the very end of the original Friday the 13th. Beyond that feat, Lehman has appeared in other horror films and indie filmmakers made by indie filmmakers over the last 15 years or so, mostly trading on that trivia fact that he was the, first Jason. Now, Seaman, aside from making the sequel to this movie last year, has another movie that just got shown at Horror Hound Weekend in Indianapolis in August, and that movie was called Cryptids. The main star that was advertised to help raise money for that movie's production was horror exploitation drive-in aficionado Joe Bob Briggs. And I think that movie will eventually appear on this show at some point. Now, The Barn kicks off in 1959 in a small town called Weary Falls. It's Halloween, and the town's gathered for church services before a big festival is about to kick off. And there is a specific place, a farm, on the outskirts of the town that is supposedly off limits to the kids. The preacher is even quite adamant that they do not leave the confines of the town to trick or treat. Now, two kids, though, decide to go where they are not supposed to go, the farm's barn. The little girl of the pair is more intent on approaching the barn, even kind of razzing her guy friend, the other little kid, that he's chicken for not wanting to go up there. And after all, there's a jack-o'-lantern lit outside the barn. That's kind of one of the rituals that's brought up in this movie, that if there's a lit jack-o'-lantern in front of a door, that means that is a place to trick or treat. Now, so it must mean that that's safe for kids. But however, who answers the door are three monsters: the Boogeyman, a ghastly miner-looking ghoul; Hollow Jack, a creature with a jack-o'-lantern for a head; and the Candy Corn Scarecrow, which is, well, a candy corn scarecrow. The Boogeyman buries his pickaxe into the little girl's head, and the boy runs off frightened, with a new reason as to why the barn is off limits to the children of Weary Falls. Now, 30 years later, Tales of the Trio of Monsters is told to the kids of another town. The story goes that if you knock 3 times and say trick or treat, they will be unleashed onto the world. 2 high school kids, Sam and Josh, are trying to celebrate their town's annual Devil's Night on October 30th. And they're trying to enjoy the festivities to its fullest. It's their last Devil's Night and Halloween before they graduate and leave town for college. Sam likes scaring kids with the stories of the barn and the various monsters, but this irritates Mrs. Barnhart, played by Linnea Quigley, who is a churchy busybody, and she likes the idea of shutting all these festivities down permanently, especially when she sees Josh, the son of the recently deceased preacher from that town, celebrating Devil's Night with Sam. But later that night, the kids see a show called Rock the Block that's hosted by Dr. Rock, played by Ari Lehman. And Dr. Rock has a band on the show called Demon Inferno, and they're going to be playing a special concert on Halloween night. Now, despite Sam and Josh being in trouble for messing with Mrs. Barnhart, Sam comes up with a plan for the 2 friends and their other friends, Michelle, Nikki, Chris, and Russell, to go to the Demon Inferno concert. And the next day, the group head off in a van to see their favorite rock band. They plan to stop at a town to pick up the things that Sam and Josh are supposed to be collecting from their town to give to Mrs. Barnhart as penance. However, when they start to drive into that town, they discover it's got a weird sign that says Deathsville on it. And Deathsville was once known as Weary Falls. But the barn still stands and looks about the same as it did 30 years ago. They camp out near the barn and await time to basically go into the town to do the trick-or-treating, to get the stuff that Sam and Josh are supposed to bring back. And then they are going to go to their concert. Sam talks about hearing about the miner, the scarecrow, and the pumpkinhead guy, and he heard the story about the boogeyman from his grandfather, who claimed to have basically witnessed the monsters himself. The kids play truth or dare, and Sam is dared to go up to the barn, knock 3 times, and say trick or treat, the whole thing. Josh and Michelle's the girl that Sam likes, decide that maybe everyone should go with Sam and do it as a group, because these stories aren't real. But they do that ritual, and sure enough, the 3 monsters are summoned. The door opens up, and the group go inside and notice all sorts of old and kind of gross things inside. Satisfied that there are no monsters or anything of interest inside the barn, everyone but Russell decide to go back out to the van. And Russell decides that he still wants to poke around the barn. However, the boogeyman pokes his pickaxe right into Russell. As Sam, Michelle, and Josh go do the trick-or-treating in Weary Falls, Chris and Nikki pitch their own tent and have sex. Chris leaves to find Russell, who he thinks was spying on them and watching them. And the candy corn scarecrow comes along to first use his sickle to cut off Nikki's arm and then kills her. Chris then finds the boogeyman and discovers Russell's been killed. So all 3 monsters chase after Chris, and Chris runs into town where Josh, Sam, and Michelle think it's a little weird that he's just running around town. But they decide not to find out what has Chris acting this way and instead decide to go to the schoolhouse where the annual Harvest Hootenanny is going on. We do see that the three monsters visit a kindly older lady of Weary Falls and kill her. In fact, there's a member of the town that goes around smashing pumpkins. He does this to make sure that the monsters don't come into the town. And this guy was the little boy at the beginning of the movie who went to the barn with the girl who was killed at the beginning of the movie. And he knows all the lore and basically has these various rules that he tries to adhere to try to keep the town safe. The main one being smashing the pumpkins. But Chris catches up with Sam and Josh, and he tells them what he saw and how the monsters are all real. Bad news for everyone at the Hootenanny, though. The monsters are inside, and they've blocked the doors. They begin slaughtering everyone at the party, and when they go back to the van near the barn, they discover that the monsters have caught up to Chris and killed him by hollowing out his head and turning it into a jack-o'-lantern. So now it's up to Sam and Josh to stop the monsters, which then should stop their rampage at midnight as long as they're not able to continue to collect the quote-unquote meat as part of this ritual. Basically, they have to stop the monsters, force them back to wherever they go to normally, and they also need to find Michelle, who got separated from them earlier as well. Now, the first monster they take on is Hollow Jack, and he has the ability to essentially possess pumpkins, which then he's able to then turn into his head, and then he kind of grows a body from that. And they decide to smash all the pumpkins in the pumpkin patch to get rid of him. The next monster they combat is the Candy Corn Scarecrow. Now, Josh seemingly takes out the Scarecrow, but before Sam can light the monster on fire, the Scarecrow stabs Josh in the stomach with a sickle. Sam gets away and is then later attacked by the Boogeyman, but Sam uses the van to basically pin the Boogeyman under the wheel. He then hears Michelle screaming from inside the barn, and he goes there and finds the town preacher giving a satanic sermon about making a deal for harvests and how curious teens were used to offer up as sacrifices. Josh, on the other hand, has disguised himself as the Scarecrow, and having turned the tables on the Scarecrow and killing that monster, helps Sam get Michelle out of the barn. Now, it turns out that there were a few other monsters that are also part of the black mass that the preacher is leading, but Sam and Josh deal with them. And Josh accidentally stabs and kills the preacher, who pulls a candle down, and it causes the barn to light on fire, just as he was kind of basically in his final moments of life. But Josh is able to soil the meat that the demons were collecting, and Sam kills the Boogeyman. As one last monster comes up from a pit in the basement of the barn, the two friends realize their work is not yet done. Meanwhile, Michelle is heading back home to where she's going to basically tell everybody about what happened, get some help, but there's still a pumpkin in the back of the van that she's driving. So let's get to the three things that I like about the barn. First, there's an honesty and earnestness to this movie. It's easy for indie horror to lean a little too hard on gore or other tropes like foul-mouthed characters or overly sexual content or loading the entire plot with unlikable characters that give us a reason to root for the monsters or killers. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that none of those things exist in this movie. I will say that for the most part, all of the characters are some varying degrees of perfectly fine to actually being quite likable. But it does feel a little more like a truer love letter to 80s and 90s style horror movies, and definitely Halloween itself. The character of Sam holds Halloween very dear. He has rules and ideas about what the proper Halloween etiquette is. For example, he wants to go trick-or-treating to collect food for Mrs. Barnhart as penance for scaring her at the beginning of the movie. He specifically wants to do this as trick-or-treating because that would kind of stick it to her a little bit, because he thinks candy given to trick-or-treaters on Halloween is in a sort of way, kind of reverse blessed. It's got like the devil's touch, he says. He also looks at trick-or-treating like an offering. If candy is given, then, you don't mess with them. There are a few other stuff like that Sam basically talks about throughout the movie. That's why when he meets the adult version of the little boy from the beginning of the movie, he takes quite an interest to what the guy is saying, because he's talking about rules that surround Halloween, and in particular these three monsters. But it's very clear that this movie is building a lore and legend around Halloween itself. It's a lovely reverence for the holiday and how it makes a lot of people feel at that time of the year. It's not just going for gore. It wants to celebrate Halloween and the genre of horror. It also takes advantage of the high school characters and their last hurrah before graduating by having them approach the plot of this movie and sneaking out of town to see a concert and running into a little bit of trouble. And it kind of treats that with a lot of reverence as well, because, that last year before you graduate high school is kind of gets a lot of kids thinking, and they start thinking about things as last hurrahs and whatnot. So it really has this kind of honest and earnest feeling to this movie, and I really appreciate that. Second, while I said this movie doesn't necessarily lean heavily on the gore element, the slaughter at the Hootenanny is kind of glorious and being gory in a fun way. It's so wildly bloody, with guts being spilled and heads being crushed and throats slashed and the candy corn scarecrow's candy corn teeth biting into people. It's great. It's not done in the way that would make you sick to your stomach. It's overly gory, but in a cartoonish way. It's a good crescendo to this, basically to the end of the second act. And it makes for that one really fun bloodbath scene that you want your monster movie to have when the movie doesn't really necessarily take itself too seriously. These are all things that really help this movie kind of be a fun watch. And that scene at the Hootenanny, while not shot in any special way or anything like that, or necessarily go for like the shock factor of oh, this is so gory and it's really gross or anything like that. It's a fun massacre, and sometimes a good horror movie just needs to have a massacre and bloodbath scene like that really kind of makes you chuckle, or it doesn't give you the bad feelings that sort of scene in a movie that takes itself extremely seriously would have. Now, third, I really like our monsters in this movie. The boogeyman isn't so new, with him basically just being a ghoul, but that said, combining a ghoul with a miner and then making him the boogeyman is kind of interesting. Hollow Jack looks great. Again, a pumpkin-headed monster isn't something that's that's brand new or anything like that. I mean, it shows up in other movies or cartoons or TV shows or whatever. But his eyes are made of like candle flames, and I think that's a digital effect that's being used there, but it looks really good in the practical mask. Also, his rising out of the ground when summoned is really well done in this movie as well. It's a good-looking monster. But then you have the candy corn scarecrow. A scarecrow monster makes a lot of sense. It's a farm. It's fall. It just makes a lot of sense. But he's also sort of a goof, right? Like, he giggles like a small child. Sometimes he sounds kind of like almost like how they would have somebody who's more of like a yokel kind of chuckle and sound kind of idiotic. So they made him a little bit more simplistic, but he's got candy corn for teeth. I think that's a neat idea. It's said that the idea of the barn came from a book that Seaman wrote when he was a little kid. And if you think of the candy corn scarecrow with his candy corn teeth, that comes right out of something that kids would do in drawings. It's a lot of imagination there. And the movie uses the monsters pretty well, and I like that there are 3 deadly creatures and not just one killer or one monster that make up the threat of this movie. And in fact, I mean, at the end of the movie, like I said, there are 3 other monsters that didn't get a whole lot of play. They were just there at that black mass. So these are interesting ideas, and obviously these 3 main monsters were the best ideas that really kind of rose to the cream of the crop and really became the stars of the movie. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch a new episode of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com, but don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Wednesday morning Film Seizure podcast and the Monday afternoon Monster Mondays show at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. Next time, we check back in with the King of the Monsters one last time before the end of the year, but this time he'll also be joined by what can only be called the Prince of the Monsters, as I talk about Son of Godzilla. Until next week, stay spooky and Happy Halloween.